Well, I'm Elizabeth Bow, Director of Labor at Wayne, and I have the privilege today of introducing today's Irving Bluestone Workplace Issues lecture. I think there's an extra word, Ruth Milkman. Much of the introduction that follows is drawn from public sources. I want to begin with quite an appreciation perspective of someone whose scholarly path and career were much influenced and aided by this work. She was, for example, a commentator on the first paper I gave at the workshop conference at Women's Street in 1981. She also remember. Since that long, well, thought that I got hired as a kindergartner, but she was also a member of a research group that I've told many stories about. That produced the volume Women in Politics Change, edited by Ruth Tilly and Patricia Gurin. And I was brought in after somebody had really dropped out, and I was the only doctoral student who was going to sole author an essay. I was not only shy, but incredibly anxious that my intellectual heroes were all around. At that meeting and at conferences over the years, I benefited from Ruth's professional kindness and intellectual generosity. Also, I will point out that unlike when I met Louise Tilly and I walked out of my shoes, I did not do this when I met her. That is a true story, by the way, and it happened in Princeton. There were so many things going on at that meeting, but it was one of the best intellectual experiences I had. Again, great gratitude to Ruth for that. I also want to talk about the importance of her early essays on women workers, the Great Depression, the gender typing of occupations, and sexual division of labor and the labor movement. All of these ideas, some of which she published when she was still a graduate student, collected in this volume. For sale by University of Illinois Press. Enormously influential on the way that I thought about labor organizing. I mean, at a time when we still had the choice of old-fashioned labor history and institutional studies and hero narratives about the great men, the great white men of labor history, especially in 19th century New England. It was a really great and a good of teaching the ability to think about something that took so much passion by thinking about the actual structures behind patterns behind it. So if you have never read some of these essays, women's work in the economic crisis, redefining women's work in the sexual division of labor in the auto industry, organizing sexual division of labor. If you haven't read them, borrow or steal and enjoy. There's a whole lot of books here. There's the collection Women Work in. Yes, there's Gender at Work, the Dynamics of Job Segregation by Sex During World War II, an enormously influential volume that kind of put to rest some of the more simplistic studies of Rosie the Riveter. Farewell to the Factory, How to Work in the Late 20th Century. It's not here, but there's another one on LA labor, and then Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat, which is her most recent book. All of these have had widespread influence and impact on the way that we think about labor, immigration, gender, and work. And that, and some, is why we brought Ruth here today. So, Ruth.
So, thank you. Still not sure we're going to have a PowerPoint, but maybe I'll start anyway. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about the recent developments in the U.S. labor movement, which I'm sure you at least know a little bit about. Some of you probably know this much more than I do. and try to put them in the framework of a currently fashionable way of thinking in sociology about movements, which is called the power resources approach. So if that's not familiar, don't worry, I'm gonna summarize it, and then just try to use the developments that we all are familiar with to varying degrees as a way of interrogating that framework and, both appreciating and criticizing it. So that's my plan. Is it working?
Yeah.
All right, maybe since it's not, well, for some of you, especially graphs, see that great? There are a few graphs here that you might want to see, so you might want to move your seat up, but it's up to you. We can also make this available through a favorite link if anybody wants the PowerPoint later, that's easy to do. So in fact, they already have it. Okay, so I call it a new political generation because one of my arguments is going to be that what's happening now is not 100%, but much of it is the product of a new generation of labor activists, and I'll have more to say about that. Okay, so I'm going to go through the first, since we're starting times you might watch this order. Or we're starting kind of late, and so I'm going to quit from the first part, which I bet is familiar to most people in this room anyway, and then we'll see what happens. As you probably are well aware, in the 2020s, we've had a number of unexpected, to many people surprising developments on the labor front. At places like Amazon, Starbucks, Apple, and Trader Joe's, and a few other iconic retailers, unions have won NLRB elections or won representation in other ways, and received enormous attention from the media and the public for doing so, because many of us thought this would never happen. Less outside the spotlight, less visibly, but probably in the long run, maybe more importantly, professionals and sort of quasi-professionals, including adjuncts and graduate students, maybe some of you, architects, doctors, journalists, museum workers, nonprofit staff have been actively unionizing. Nurses too. And this is quite different from the Amazon, Starbucks stuff, for reasons I'll get into. Anyway, combining all this together in the 2020s, union election petitions, that's a technical term for filing with the National Labor Relations Board for a representation election, have grown quite dramatically in the 2020s. There's some numbers here, and maybe more impressively, unions have been winning more than 2/3 of the elections in the last few years, reversing a decline in win rates over the last decade or so. As I don't have to tell you, here in Detroit, there's also been a big uptick in strike activity, not just in the auto industry, but in Hollywood studios, the University of California, you mentioned her strike in 2022. In various healthcare settings, especially among nurses. Now we have the Boeing strike, so there's something going on, right? I mean, we know that. So what the sort of background to all this is the pandemic spotlight on so-called essential workers. It's sort of already in memory maybe, but I think that has kind of gotten the ball rolling. And this may not last either, a very tight labor market has contributed to this. So we now have public support for unions on a scale that has not been seen in half a century, according to the Gallup poll and other such surveys. This is, if you can see it, it's just showing the NLRB elections and win rates I mentioned. And here's the Gallup poll from 1936 to the present. Do you approve or disapprove of labor unions? And you can see that it's more or less an all-time high, slightly higher in the 1950s, the approve rate. So again, something's happened. Okay, shifting gears for a minute, I want to tell you a little bit about power resource theory. How many people here are sociology land people and know about this already, or a few of you, but not very many. Okay. So this is basically, like I said, it's sort of a trendy thing right now in my field, and I think it is a useful way of thinking about workers' power. Basically, theory may be too grandiose, it's more of an approach. Sometimes it's called PRA. it's based on a typology of so-called power resources that workers and or unions or other labor organizations can deploy in their struggles with employers. And it dates back to some work by Eric Olin Wright many years ago, who sort of specified one dichotomy of power resources, what he called Eric Wright called associational power versus structural power, and that was further developed by Beverly Silver in a book I've had a lot of you heard of called Forces of Labor. And then other people, Corpy and others, have developed it further. And then and that was a while ago, but more recently, like I said, it's become the subject of a lot of discussion. So let me just give you some definitions. I think you will find it useful, but there is a lot of jargon, so bear with me. So structural power, what does that mean? Let me start with association. Associational power is just the power you get by uniting with other workers. It's kind of simple, right? We all kind of appreciate that. You're stronger than one, blah, blah, blah. It's a pretty basic idea that is central to all kinds of labor organizing. Structural power is different. Structural power means your position in the labor market structure gives you some power. So the classic example would be subway workers in my city, New York. If they stop working, the whole city stops. Or other transport workers can have that kind of power too. Think about people who unload ships, port workers, longshore, etc. So that's often called workplace bargaining power as opposed to marketplace bargaining power. You also have structural power if there's a shortage of people who can replace you. Like we saw in remember a couple of years ago, the journalists dubbed it Striketober. That was 2021 with that strike at John Deere and Kellogg's cereal, and that some of you will remember those. You know, in recent years, there haven't been that many strikes because in this country, it is legal for employers to replace, quote, permanently replace strikers, and they do not have to be hired back after the strike is settled. You may know the Detroit News tragic story. That's where that happened there. It's happened in many places. So that is, to put it mildly, put a damper on strike activity. But John Deere had 10,000 workers, and in 2021, there was a labor shortage. So they couldn't permanently replace 10,000 people. It was impossible. And so they had marketplace bargaining power, basically the power that comes from a tight labor market. And most workers have had that the last few years, right? So that's another kind of structural power. All right. I already talked about associational power. So now people have, that was the original framework, those two things. But now we got this whole long list of other kinds of power. So one of them is symbolic power. A colleague that Heidi Gottfried and I know quite well, Jennifer Chun, developed this idea of, that if you can name and shame an employer for doing bad things to workers, that sometimes gives you power, right? Sometimes it's called discursive, sometimes it's called ideational, you know how sociologists like to make up, all right? So, but it's all kind of the same thing. Invoking social justice claims on behalf of workers can be a source of power. So that's like another power resource potentially available to workers. Yet another that has been added to the list is institutional power. And that's easy to understand. That comes from laws and regulations, usually rooted in previous struggles. So in this country, as you all know, we have the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, still the law of the land, although variably enforced, to put it mildly, over the decades. But it's a resource, right? You can, and to our eye, Mason, I don't know about yours. I remember watching that Amazon victory in Staten Island. People pay attention to this. They were showing the NLRB officials counting the votes on YouTube. And it was like this Time Warp thing. They had these like paper ballots. And this woman is like, she's my age, standing there. Yes. Yes. No, it was a sort of creaky machine. But there it is, and that's institutional power. They won that election. Of course, they've never gotten any. We'll see about that. But anyway, that's institutional power, the ability to draw on things like that, the rights that you have embedded in the law and so on. Just isn't always there, but it's that's another kind of power. Coalitional power has been added to this list. I think we're all familiar with how that works when unions or worker centers call on allies in the local community. Sometimes those are faith leaders or students or whatever. That is another source of power. So anyway, you could probably add more, but those are the main ones that people talk about. So I just want to point out a few things about this. I think it is a useful way of thinking about workers' power. It sometimes needs more nuance. So the first point to make is that not all these resources are equivalent or equal to one another, right? They vary in potency. And as you probably already know this, but as I'll point out, some of the recent organizing and mobilization efforts that I listed earlier have gained more traction than others because they draw on different kinds of power, and some are more powerful. I don't know, that sounds sort of like tautological, but I mean, they're not all equal, right? So in this case, the ones that rely mainly on symbolic power, and I would put the Amazon, Trader Joe's, Apple, Starbucks in that category, were met with very strong resistance from employers. So at Amazon, nothing's happened essentially since that election in terms of any kind of collective bargaining. Starbucks, they supposedly are bargaining. I'll believe it when I see it if they ever actually get a contract, but that's a whole story in itself. Most of the others, the employers just stonewall it, which is of course not new, but it means, so they did have a lot of symbolic power. Again, they got tremendous media attention publicly about it, but it hasn't really resulted in any kind of permanent organization or even, significant gains for workers, arguably. The campaigns that were able to leverage the structural power and especially workplace bargaining power, as opposed to the tight labor market, have fared somewhat better. And this goes back to an idea that, I don't know, some of you probably know this guy because he's in Michigan. He's retired now, but Howard Kimmeldorf, who taught labor sociology for many years at Michigan, at Ann Arbor, wrote this great article some years back about how, it's actually about the early 20th century, but about how the ability of employers to replace workers or the lack of ability to do so is key to whether unions get traction. And that applies to this too. So you probably know that interns and residents, doctors in the making, have been organizing a lot recently. Unlike a Starbucks barista, a hospital can't just hire somebody off the street to replace a striking resident. It doesn't work, right? Or for that matter, an adjunct professor or a graduate student worker, right? So that means that workplace, so that's a form of power that's a lot more, gets a lot more traction than the symbolic stuff that we're seeing in some of the less skilled jobs where people have been organizing. And so that's just one thing. Not all power resources are equal. And then in the strikes that we've seen recently by long established unions like the UAW here in Detroit, SAG-AFTRA, others, having institutional power mattered, having a long tradition of recognition from the employers, and it's shaky in many ways, but still it made a difference. And those strikes also deployed symbolic power, especially under Shawn Fain here in Detroit. I mean, you all know that story better than I imagine, so I won't elaborate. Okay, and I already said about the tight labor market. Okay, another problem with the power resource approach, in my view, is that it doesn't have much to say about employer power and employer power resources. It's sort of obvious, right, that matters too. And it especially matters in these cases I'm mentioning, like the big, if you're up against Jeff Bezos, it's kind of different than if you're up against, I don't know, if people know the story of Burgerville, it's a small food chain in the northwest of the US that did successfully organize it, get kind of forever, but they did win contracts and all. That was a company that, the organizers were very clever, but they were at Amazon and Starbucks too, but they weren't up against as formidable an opponent. So that matters enormously. And it's completely exogenous to the power resource approach. And then there's another thing that, this is not my insight, but I stole it from somebody called Marissa Brooks, who wrote just a very short piece about this that I found extremely compelling. Which is that the literature that I'm talking about treats associational power, the first one, as sort of one more on this long list of resources. But Marissa Brooks points out that it's actually different from all the others. It's unique. Here's a quote from her article. The power in associational power is not exercised by workers over employers, right? Unlike, say, symbolic power or structural power, but rather by workers over other workers. That is, associational power is the ability of union leaders, shop stewards, or rank and file union members to compel other members of their organization to do something they otherwise would not do. That is, to behave as a collective actor. That's completely different from the other stuff, right? And so it's just another, I mean, that's not a fatal flaw in the theory, but it is a complexity that needs to be taken seriously in my view. So what I would argue is that associational power, activating associational power, is a precondition for all the others. And of course, to do that requires something very basic and that we all know is important, namely leadership, which is also exogenous to the framework. It's kind of hard to imagine how you're going to deploy associational power without somebody taking the helm and, you know, organizing everybody else or somebody's. And then there's another story, which is Liz already mentioned. I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the years. Just there's some variation among different types of workers and how receptive they are to leadership. And that might depend partly on who are, you know, there's all that complexity too, which is not really in the framework. So all these are limitations on the ability of this framework to explain the developments I summarized at the beginning. When a new set of actors rose into leadership with a different worldview than those who preceded them, and that's what I want to turn to now. Some of you are in this population of young activists, I imagine. I don't know if you're activists, but some of you look pretty young. I think that makes a difference. So I've written about this in a completely different context, not to do with labor, but like the generation that led the Occupy Wall Street movement and some other social movements that appeared around the same time. And at the time I was thinking about this initially, there wasn't a lot happening among this generation in the labor movement, but now there is. So I'm kind of extending it to fit this other thing. So there's this other dead white sociologist, male sociologist called Carl Mannheim, who some of you may have heard of, who wrote a long time ago about a theory of political generations. And what's important, what makes it sociological as opposed to like a marketing theory or a, you know, the way like millennials are talked about in the advertising world or something, is that his argument was that being in a particular generation is not the result of just like the accident of what year you were born, but generations are formed by historical and social events in each generation's history, and particularly the events that big events that shape people in their formative years, meaning adolescence, young adulthood. So as you're coming of age, what matters is the dramatic developments occurring in the society around you, right? So we talk, for example, about, my parents were part of this, the Depression generation, referring to the 1930s, people whose worldview was formed by their experience of that crisis, right? Well, we didn't have one of those in our lifetimes, but we did have the 2008 financial crash. And I argue that this was extremely consequential for millennials and later Gen Zers in shaping the way they see the world. As you've all noticed, in those two generations, you know, some others too, but especially those two, there's been the emergence of a new population of people with radical worldviews. Many of them call themselves socialists or sometimes Marxists, sometimes other things, but they are anti-capitalist in some way or another. This was particularly dramatic in the time of the Sanders campaigns, but kind of around. And I dated to Occupy Wall Street, but arguably it started even before that. But, well, we can talk about that later if you want. In a way, it starts with Obama's 2008 campaign, which was the first time that generation was infatuated with a political candidate, and of course later disillusioned by him. That's the most. So I'm just skipping this because I've already said it. There's a British journalist who coined a phrase that I find very useful here, which is a guy called Paul Mason, who talked about what he called the graduate future. So well, some of you may identify with this idea that, you know, you do everything you're supposed to do because college educated young people are particularly prominent in this new generation of radicals, right? You do what you're supposed to do. You study hard in school, you graduate from college, accumulating a lot of debt along the way, maybe, and then you face the post 2008 labor market, right? So that is a recipe for radicalization. Blocked aspirations, you might call it. These are kind of old-fashioned ideas, but I think we've seen them acquire a new life. At the same time, I think partly because of college education, these young people have a lot of confidence about their ideas about the world, which makes a difference when you're trying to mobilize in a social movement or organize a union or whatever. And that's, I think, why the college educated are overrepresented among activists, because they believe that they have a belief in their own effectiveness, which comes with class privilege. It's true in Black Lives Matter too. For this earlier project, I did some research on the, you know, Black Lives Matter was a movement. I'm talking about the first version of it, but it's true in 2022. They describe themselves as leaderless, like Occupy did. Remember that? And so there weren't identifiable leaders like there are in labor unions today. What we did was we took all the names that appeared in press accounts of Black Lives Matter in 2014 when it first took off. And if they appeared more than once, we counted them as leaders, and then we looked them up on social media, mostly Facebook. And they were almost all college educated. They were, of course, Black. They were disproportionately female, and interestingly queer. I'm not quite sure what that's about, but it was very striking. And the same thing is visible in the labor world now. You may have noticed in Starbucks, for example, there are all these trans organizers. So maybe we could talk about why that is. I'm not sure I can explain it, but it's striking. Anyway, and overwhelmingly college educated. So it's not just random young people. Anyway, you all know this part. High levels of student debt, facing, you know, especially in urban areas, some incredibly ridiculous housing costs. And also, I don't know, there's a small literature on this idea of waithood. Have you heard of this? It means like, so when I was starting out in life, you know, you went to college, you graduated, you did something else, and that was that. You were a grown-up. Now, you go to college, get an internship, maybe it's unpaid. You spend a few years doing that, then you maybe go to some other country for a while, then you might go back to school. So the sort of coming of age process is stretched out over a much longer period of time. You're waiting to become an adult. That's waithood. So that's also something new, and it doesn't help with all this. I mean, it contributes to what I'm talking about. Okay, so back to the labor world. These folks form an emerging, what some people call militant minority. That's a term that dates back to the labor historian David Montgomery, who some of you I'm sure are familiar with, but has been popularized again recently by some sociology folks. And so there is this group of, you know, you could call them cadre labor organizers who are committed to organizing in the labor movement. If any of you have ever gone to a labor notes event, you've seen that they're all this generation pretty much. Well, that's not quite true, not all, but 3/4 of it. There are some older folks too, here and there. And then besides those who are like really deeply committed to all this, there's a much bigger population that are highly receptive to these ideas for the same reasons. They may not be the leaders, but they're ready. When someone shows up at their Starbucks store and says, I'm ready to unionize, they sign up. You know all this? This is a very different worldview, that back to Mannheim again, this idea of, you know, generational worldview, than previous generations of radicals had. It's intersectional, that's central to it. I have a kid from this generation who I still remember coming home from college and using this word intersectionality, which I thought was like an academic term that, you know, because it does come from Kimberly Crenshaw, the feminist theorist. Like, where'd you get that? Now it's just like a regular word, this crowd, right? It's not like, so, and well, I don't have to explain it to you. This generation is also much more diverse demographically than any previous one in this country. So this is different from being a new leftist who's a Marxist or something, or my generation of Marxist feminists who were the beginnings of intersectionality, perhaps. Heidi's part of this crowd too, and Liz as well. our identity, but now it's much more complex, right?
all
It's
about
actually not just gender and patriarchy and capitalism, but racism and disability and sexuality and on. So this is not a trivial phenomenon. Millennials plus Gen Z taken together make up almost half the United States workforce today. So, there's something happening here. And they're also more diverse in terms of, well, I already said this about gender and queerness. Both women and queer people seem to be overrepresented among this new generation of activists. Time back. Hey, not having the time. How are we doing? I'm not sure I have to go through all this. I can't see it there anyway, but
440, 438,
430?
438.
440. All right, I'm gonna race through this then. Again, I can share this later if you can't see it. There's a lot of polling data that show that this generation is much more sympathetic to socialism, much more critical of capitalism, much more committed to diversity, much more familiar with gender neutral pronouns. I'm still learning how to manage those myself, but I bet the young people here have no problem, right? Like all that kind of thing. And when it comes to labor, this is a chart of the percentage of people who agree that, quote, labor unions have a positive effect on the way things are going in this country by age. It's highest for the young, and that declines. And it's even true that, can't really see this either, but Gen Z's union support is greater than union support of older generations when they were young. Like this is always a tricky thing when you're talking about this stuff, like, there's that old cliche about how we'll grow up and become more conservative, but it doesn't, that may be part of it, but that's not the only thing going on here. There really is something new. Okay, I already mentioned about the militant minority. This is not a huge group, but you don't need a huge group of leaders. You just need a critical mass. It doesn't have to be everybody. And it is modest compared to, say, the 1930s and 40s, the glory days of this city that we're standing in here, but they're growing. And another key thing is that many of these young folks enter the labor movement with experience in other social movements. So there's I'm sort of waving the sociology flag here, which I usually do. I am technically a sociologist, but I kind of want to be a historian, so it's a little odd for me, but I'm going to do it anyway. There's this classic piece of labor sociology by Kim Voss and Rachel Sherman. Some of you may have read it. It was published in the year 2000, and it's about an earlier wave of labor revitalization in the 1990s under John Sweeney, for those of you who are old enough to remember all that. And they point out in that classic article that when a union has activists in it who can draw on social movement repertoires from other kinds of activism, that helps them revitalize. And so we're seeing that again now. And in any case, the labor activists of today, the young ones, part of that intersectional worldview is that they see labor as just one component in a larger multi-pronged social movement. So right now it's Gaza. In 2020, Black Lives Matter, it's all the same thing. It's one set of interlocking oppressions. So labor is part of it, and many are very passionate about that piece, but they don't see it as some, privileged part of the social movement landscape. It's just part of this bigger whole. And the key point is that they offer much needed new leadership for a demoralized labor movement that's been beaten down for quite a few decades now. I don't have to tell you that in this city. Okay, so back to my PRA stuff. I'm sorry, this is so telescope. So the most visible celebrated efforts of this new generation ran up quickly against the limits of symbolic power that I mentioned earlier. So, that was the story at Amazon, for example. Social justice dramas that spotlighted employer abuses, remember that? We are not robots, etc. Featuring very sympathetic characters like Chris Smalls, if you remember him, fighting the evil forces like Jeff Bezos. I mean, that was so they had that symbolic power, and it did get a lot of attention and traction, but meanwhile, still a non-union company. Now, companies that are concerned about their public image, which Amazon surely is, and Starbucks, as are all these, are vulnerable to this kind of campaign to some degree, but they also have a lot of resources of their own, as I already mentioned. So at the time that this all took off, those workers did have some marketplace bargaining power. Amazon actually did raise pay for a little while during the height of the pandemic when they desperately needed more workers and they weren't sure what. But they don't have the other kind of structural power, workplace bargaining power. The turnover is sky high. And that's part of the business model that those companies rely on. So there's a sociologist called Eric Blank, who some of you may have heard about, who's got a forthcoming book about this. He's changed the jargon, but for a while he was calling it DIY, do it yourself organizing. Now I think it's worker to worker organizing. The point he makes, which is really key, is that this new wave of organizing occurred with very few resources from traditional existing unions. Instead, workers taught each other how to organize. So like, and Starbucks is the classic example. You know, the original effort was in Buffalo, New York. You probably remember, if you follow the stuff, you know what I'm talking about. That was a Salt who had been, you know, it wasn't an accident that it in that store. But once it did, workers there taught each other over Zoom how to have an NLRB election. And luckily, they didn't know that much about it before that, or they wouldn't have done it because, you know, the chances of doing it, well, anyway. But it's true. It was an advantage to not know much. But anyway, they taught each other to work. Do you do it yourself? So it didn't, you know, one of the classic Blank points out that the literature on why organizing has been so pathetic in recent years is that it's expensive and unions, you know, are reaching to invest a lot of resources in something that the payoff is uncertain and employers have less power, et cetera. Well, this greatly reduces the costs, right? So that's huge. And again, these are educated people who are not so easily intimidated by employers as someone, you know, more vulnerable might be. They have that class confidence I mentioned. So there's something that this is quite effective. And they use social media, which is one thing that young people are good at, unlike some of us. Their institutional power is very minimal in these symbolic campaigns. I mean, they did use the NLRB creaking machinery, but as we've seen, even extreme, you know, even with Biden in the White House and Jennifer Abuso at the head of the National Labor Relations Board, blatant violations of the labor law have gone unpunished. And so, and very few established unions have stepped up to help. Some have, like Workers United, to their credit, in the case of Starbucks, and now the Teamsters are embracing the Amazon thing. We'll see what comes of that, but at least they're trying. Okay, and then I'm gonna not repeat all this about the highly educated academics, journalists, museum workers, doctors, etc. They have gotten much more traction. They have not only won elections, but won contracts and won raises. And, you know, again, the scale is modest, but that has a lot more lasting power so far than the other. And they have support from traditional unions. So, you know, there's this joke, I'm sure you've heard this in Detroit, that UAW should change its name to the Union of Academic Workers, because a quarter of their members now are based in universities of one, you know, sort or not. The University of California being the biggest, but it's all over, and there's a bunch of them in New York and elsewhere too. The News Guild has been organizing like crazy among journalists, including at the LA Times. I lived in LA for 20 years, and the LA Times was legendary for its anti-unionism for over a century, but they cracked it. So this is low-hanging fruit for those established unions, because they get it that these workers are hard to replace and therefore organizable, quote unquote. And then the strikes. Again, I guess I've already said a lot of this. Here we saw multiple power resources. Yes, symbolic power. Think of the UAW's dramatic strike. What it is now, more than a year ago, I guess. So this is different. The workers in the U.S. auto plants are not millennials and Gen Zers, and they aren't college educated, right? It's not. This is not what I was talking about at Starbucks and Amazon. However, with new leadership, the UAW was able to harness smoldering rank and file anger about the disparity between what the CEOs were taking home and the big profits that the companies were making versus, you know, them having agreed to all these concessions long ago and then again in 2008. And with imagination and leadership, that was galvanized into an effective strike. And you probably know this too, being here in Detroit, but although they were not the rank and file workers, this generation were very central to the strategic thinking behind that strike and some of the others. So maybe you saw this article in the Wall Street Journal. There's Sean Fain. This was meant to be like dissing the UAW. 3 young activists who never worked in an auto factory helped deliver a huge win for the UAW. And it's about Chris Brooks and a couple others who were hired by Fain to help launch that campaign. And they were this generation and they had a lot of experience in various social movements. They were this militant minority. They were staffers. They weren't followers, but they made a huge difference. So even there, you do see the thumbprints of this generational thing. Okay, I'm almost done. I just want to say, despite my enthusiasm for all these developments, their scale is very modest. That has not moved the needle on union density. Only 6% of private sector workers in this country are union members. That has not changed despite all the stuff, right? That's the purple right there. If you can't see the details, you can see that line going down. We have not turned that around. And the second one on the right side is strikes. Okay, yeah, there've been some more strikes lately. Starts really with those red state teacher strikes in 2018. In some ways, it's the beginning of this new wave of strikes, and then it takes off again more in the last couple of years. But it's nothing compared to the good old days. Look at that. That goes back to 1947. So there's something happening here. It's probably important, but I don't know. I think of it as like a tender flower that needs a lot of sunlight and nurturance to blossom and grow. And it remains to be seen whether that is going to happen or whether it's just going to be stamped out by whoever, whoever's in power in this country. And we'll see what happens in November. That'll make a difference too. But I don't even just mean that. Employers are very capable of snuffing this out. So I don't want to be too much of a Pollyanna here, but on the other hand, I think there's something important happening, and whatever else changes, this generation is not going away. Again, it's half the workforce that is sympathetic to this stuff, and many older people are too. So we'll see. Anyway, I'm just going to stop there. Thank you. Stuff, yeah.
Absolutely. So that's 4:50.
I thought fast. That's what we do in New York.
We have the room until 6 o'clock.
Oh,
So there's
okay.
hors d'oeuvres and coffee.
So that's what's rushing.
So we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion.
The floor's open. Yes. And could you say who you are, since I hardly know any of you?
Sure, yeah. My name is Janine Lenz. I'm a historian of workers in true revolutionary France. I'm guilds, so definitely some distinct questions but in a very different context. But I was struck when you were talking about the importance of the Obama campaign to the emergence of this militant minority. And then talking about relational organizing, which seems to be one of the secret weapons of the Harris campaign right now. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the cross-fertilization between labor organizing and political organizing. And do they reinforce each other? Do they weaken each other? So kind of how do they?
That's a great one. Well, here I do have a pet theory about the Obama thing, which is probably nonsense, but I'll share it anyway. So remember, some of you don't remember, some of you are really young. I'm looking at this guy here, for example. But then you don't remember, like it's a kid in 2008, right? But those of you who remember that year, remember the right wing said, oh, Obama, he's a socialist. We can't have him as president. We're hearing it again now about Kamala. Well, I think for young people, it's like they love Obama. So it's like, oh, if he's a socialist, I better look that up. What is a socialist? Serious. You think that's part of how this happened? DSA became a thing again. all that. Like, it was not in the vocabulary of folks. Really, it wasn't. It was sort of after the, 2008, like the Soviet Union collapsed in what, 1991? Like, this was just like not, the kind of red baiting thing was gone. And then there it was again. So I do think that was the beginning. And then, of course, we had Sanders, who made it really a brand and a popular thing. So this is not really answering your question, but I think that did contribute to the radicalization and the openness to thinking about capitalism and all the things that are screwed up about it for this whole new generation of young folks. Who then, it's a short step from thinking about capitalism to thinking about labor. Like, that's sort of comes with, it's part of the package, right? And so that created, that was the beginning. And then I think people have moved back and forth between, just kind of interested in this generational thing, because I did some research with a couple of my colleagues at CUNY on Occupy Wall Street. I had just moved to New York a couple of years before, and then this landed on our doorstep, and it was like completely amazing. Like, it seemed like it came out of nowhere, which of course we learned it hadn't, but it seemed like that at the moment, right? And we did this little survey of Zuccotti Park. Remember that? So I know you don't. Like some of the older people here do. That was where Occupy was centered first in New York City. And we discovered that they were highly educated, actually relatively privileged, mostly millennial, the activists. So that's how I first glommed onto this idea that there's something happening here generationally. And then it turned out Black Lives Matter was more or less the same group. They were different color, but they were the same generation and so on. Actually, they were different gender-wise. Than Occupy was pretty male-dominated, in fact. But still, so there was like this whole wave of social movements, not just those, but remember, we don't hear about this much anymore, but the Dreamers, the immigrant activists, they were also by definition young, because you had to pay a board at certain times to be eligible for DACA, right? And there was a feminist version of it too, the early Me Too movement, which was mostly on campuses. So there was all this stirring, and then a lot of them embraced the Occupy people, moved pretty directly into the Sanders campaign, right? So there is a kind of synergy between that kind of electoral politics. I don't know if Harris is quite in that group.
Well, I just like a lot of the grassroots now is focusing on relational.
Relational is not, I didn't
Use that word. No, I
associational.
yeah, I'm using that on.
Okay. What do you mean by relational?
To peer to peer, go to.
Like, why not?
I think that they're trying to institutionalize that, where they're teaching people.
Yeah, well, it's not a new idea, actually. Workers organizing each other, train to train, or it's for those of us who've been around for a while, these are not totally new concepts. But yeah, that's how you do grassroots organizing, right? In any arena, I think. The Harris thing is complicated. But I wasn't there. But did anyone here go to the Labor Next conference in Chicago this year? I was told that all the energy was around Gaza. And so that's what I meant about the kind of fluidity and I call it intersectional, but I don't know if Gaza fits into that exactly. But this idea that, climate, I didn't even mention, that's another big arena, right? Where young people are in the vanguard. So it's all one thing to them. The world is screwed up. We have to fix it. And so, yeah, electoral politics can fit into that. I don't know if Harris does or not. I'm curious to know what you guys think. I think the Gaza thing is a deal breaker for some folks. I'm not one of them. I'm for Palestinian rights, but I also think we have to get rid of Trump. All that, but not, especially here in Michigan, as I understand it, it's not so clear. So I don't know quite how that works. Now, organized labor has always been, since for a century, been very involved in electoral politics. That's not a new, but I think this generation is different and much more skeptical about all that. So,
yeah, as an expert in this generation, definitely, I graduated.
You're the man of my story.
PhD because he couldn't get a job doing anything else as an engineer. So I think kind of interesting coming from that perspective. But thinking about it's also something else to work with older. I'm a labor organizer now to some capacity, and to work with older workers who in the same breath as saying democracy is over and it's young people's fault somehow for not being involved in electoral politics, they don't want to support new policies that would enable more people to participate in electoral policy.
Like, for example.
Like voter rights, like accepting immigrants, like creating a pathway for immigrants to be legal citizens. Yeah, there's lots of examples of conservative older folks from previous generations who benefited from the intergenerational wealth created in part by good labor jobs, organized jobs, then denying our ability to participate in that same thing. So I'm interested in this concept of this, like symbolic power not being as valuable, or being as
Well, as powerful, right? I know that sounds tautological, but.
The wins, when I guess I see it as more, we have so many more merit because of the huge deregulation and the systematic work by major political actors to disincentivize unionization, put so many barriers between us and unionization, or any other labor policy. Like here in Michigan, all local labor policy is preempted by the state constitution. We can do no local labor policy here.
Does that include like minimum wage hikes and stuff?
Minimum wage, but also things like,
Paid family leave.
sick days.
Yeah.
We have
Yeah, it's not just Michigan, but yes, I'm familiar with.
So there's state federal blocks, there's state blocks, there's employer blocks. So I guess I question whether it's that symbolic power is not as powerful, or if it's that we just can't be, like a moral argument is not going to overcome
The institutional obstacles. Yeah, I think that's right.
So, part of, I think, the disillusion by some of us, for folks like Harris, whether we vote for her or not, with just like the entire entity of like sort of trying to get us involved in democracy, in like electoral politics on one end, while slamming us with electoral politics on the other by, just through like a totally ineffective federal government, not allowing local communities to manage their own laws in any way, which is like a perverse conservative project that I don't understand totally. I mean, I do, but I
No,
don't.
it's very strategic on their part. It's not an accident.
No, it's like we want local policy, but also you're not allowed to do local policy. So I guess I'm wondering, like, what is the solution? Is the only solution?
Yes,
Take that. If all we have is moral arguments, but that doesn't move the needle on how many people are unionized, but we can't do anything else. Like,
no, it's not all we have. I just think we need a more nuanced analysis of what resources we do have. That is one of them. But again, like, I don't know what you do for a living, but your husband with the PhD in engineering does have more than symbolic power, right? He is a skill that folks
teaching back.
Right, but you know what I'm saying? It's like, it's not everybody is in that boat. Not everybody's a barista or whatever. And so you have public support on your side. You have, but you're raising something much more formidable, I think, which is to do with the kind of broader political landscape and the ways in which the right has captivated the hearts and souls of so many white working class men. I think that's what we're talking about, who are resistant to the intersectional worldview that I was trying to describe and that you clearly have. Like that's the kind of main divide that we're facing in November, certainly. And it's not really new, but it's been opportunistically exploited by the right in a very effective way. And I think like this part of the Harris's problem is she comes off as part of that elite group that is disdain, not as bad as Hillary Clinton maybe, but sort of the same problem, right? Along with everything else. But I mean, I'm voting for it. Don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying that this is a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And that's part of why it is, even though we've got this clown running on the other side, like that's why it's so close. Like there are people who really don't buy into all that. So I don't know, David, and then whoever you put.
Two things. One, in your discussion, especially this generation of people who are say from 25 to 40, you talked about the UAW mobilizing anger at the way in which bonuses and salaries versus. But
Corporate power too, more generally,
but
right? Yeah.
apropos this generation you're talking about, they're also the first generation that really had a crash course in the consequences of the economy, because they're the ones who have these massive debts because of education. So education and so they're very aware of, sort of, being critical of the way the economy works because it's not working for them.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that, so I thought about when you were commenting about how, the leadership, female or gay, lesbian, they were a group of people from a very early age that had to really assert themselves in terms of identity. And so taking leadership roles was not difficult because they were already, not to misuse of the term, but they were already out in some way because they were in front of, high school activities, college activities, and by the time they were in the workforce and these social movements, it's sort of not a surprise that these people feel most comfortable being vulnerable and aggressive at the same time.
Well, and also maybe more sensitive to injustice because they experience it daily. I mean, I don't know. I still think it's more complex than that, and I don't fully understand it, but that's definitely an element.
And
Yeah.
apropos this last comment about politics, one of the things we keep forgetting is that the right in this country for the last at least 2 decades have focused on local government, state governments, city governments, county governments. And that's where an awful lot of what you're talking about is happening. And while the left is always worrying about national government, they're forgetting. So, and it's become really important with with Trump's first election, when you saw that 6 million votes more didn't buy you a win.
Yeah.
I mean, we remembered Bush and Gore, but it wasn't as salient as it is now. And it's because of the control over local political.
Which has only increased since then.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's huge. No, I agree completely. Somebody had their hand up over there and then you, yeah. And then you.
I'm Jeremy Moy, I teach history at GE. So we just came up on 25 years from the Battle of Seattle.
Yes,
And so that was,
that's an earlier generation of radicals for sure.
I mean, I was interested to see what has changed, because that was, a group of people that were united by a broad range of concerns, was organizing with very intersectional, who were more diverse than any previous generation.
Do people know what he's talking about? This is the protest in 1999. Yeah.
Seattle, Quebec City, Western. And we were organizing along, not just anti-capitalism, certainly saw capitalism in a global perspective. Certainly talked about coming from generations with, after 10 years of Reagan and after Bill Clinton, worst outcomes for young people in terms of jobs. A group of people who were using, the early internet to organize online. A group of people who were concerned with gender and sexual violence as part of their organizing. And what happened to those people? How do they fit into that story?
I think they were the planners of Occupy Wall Street.
And that's true. I think that other part of the
They
story.
were the elders. That's what the young people who glommed onto Occupy called them at the time. Well, you know this. I mean, that's who they were. So they weren't exactly socialists, a lot of them. Some were, but a lot of them were anarchists. They were, that tendency. But yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. There weren't as many of them, but they were in a way the prefigurative politics of that time. And
Isn't that the Gen X? I mean,
yes, there was no left in between.
I'm just saying, what's different from that group than now? If you're looking for
2008 is different. I think the big things are the transformation in the economy since then. And that movement, maybe that would have blossomed into something like what I'm trying to describe, but then came 9/11, which kind of squashed it, right? And squashed also there was also an immigrant rights movement in that period that went right into the deep freeze after 9/11. And then it all comes back after 2008.
And so that kind of.
So I think it's the prologue to the story I'm trying to tell. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I raised it, because that is what happened in Canada, that happened to Canadians, that happened to G20 in Toronto, it happened in Quebec, it happened in Seattle, it happened in, of course, New York and LA.
Yes.
And so is the movement we are seeing something that is allowed to exist within certain confines, but, will face an enormous amount of oppression, like Black Lives Matter, like the organizers in Ferguson did,
Maybe.
like the families involved in. What do you think is possible given,
I wish
I
I
like
knew
that
the
you brought
answer.
in employer.
Yeah.
So yeah, what do you think is possible in terms of what
Repression.
face in terms of employer power, state power, so.
I mean, November will make a difference there, obviously. If Trump wins, it's all over, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you know, that's something that we know what that will bring, but short of that, I don't know. I mean, I think it's up to people who do the organize. I don't have an answer to that. But these things don't just happen. People have to lead them. And so I guess I would just say it depends on social struggles. I don't know. It sounds so corny, but that is what I think. I don't have the answer. You were next and then you, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Sharon Lee from political science. I study volatile Latin America, so I'm studying there. So my question is actually about the employer power. So this is not, your comment that within our research theory.
It's not taken up seriously enough. Yeah.
And I was thinking about Starbucks.
Uh-huh.
I was thinking about how you move the needle on employer power. So Starbucks right now, the business model is sort of crumbling in many ways, at least from what I read.
Mhm.
And I was thinking about my proud days as a UAW member, as a grad student in California. And Starbucks was kind of really just catching on then. People loved to work there because of excellent benefits. And that was part of why, I felt like people were ready to buy into this sort of generic looking coffee shop. So I was just thinking about that in the context of employer power. Like, how would we get an employer like Starbucks to rethink its business model to be pro-worker as a means of rectifying some of this, like, loss it's seeing in the market?
I mean, if they, I don't have a good answer to that, except, what brought them to the bargaining table, they are in theory bargaining right now. Do people know the backstory about this? Like, apparently, I mean, I only know this from secondary accounts, but I'm pretty sure it's true. It actually is related to Gaza, that they started losing business in the Middle East. And people there were really sympathetic to the union campaign. That's how they got to the bargaining table. Now, whether they're going to stay there, and they've done all this leadership shuffling and all too, so who knows? But they did begin to see that they were up against more than they thought. It wasn't just the NLRB and Jennifer Brusso and all that. It was something bigger and, that had global echoes and stuff. So, I mean, it's a Latin America. So I don't know if there's a similar movement there, but it really mattered. I mean, and well, that's apparently how it started. So in principle, you could imagine that happening, that they would realize that, and if you talk to the organizers at Starbucks, it is interesting. A lot of them, just like what you described, they wanted to work there because they thought it was a progressive company. And then they saw that they were treated badly, just like any other job. And so that's kind of what galvanized the union in the first place, right? Like this sort of contradiction between the BS ideology of the company and what was actually happening, where they had to rush and then air conditioning leaking on them and whatever else. You probably all heard these stories. So, but then it's also this, it is it's clearly generational. And a lot of them are college graduates who can't get the jobs they thought they were going to get and end up doing that for those reasons, right? So it's a kind of overdetermined or whatever. Now, whether the company can figure out, like, you're right, it would be in their interest to take this all seriously, but I don't know if that's possible. I mean, that you could argue that about a lot of.
Yeah, this comes out of my, I'm a social work researcher, but I work on labor workplace policies and trying to get companies to do things that are obviously covered. Like the business, we call it the business. Right?
Yeah, the business case.
You have to prove the business case. Well, over and over again, I'm getting to the point that I'm like, do we have to prove the business case?
You're not going to prove it until you're blue in the face, but they don't.
It's an attitude of value.
It's an ideology.
Control this. They're like with remote work and COVID things, a lot of times when it's like more productive time to go out, but they want you in the workplace.
Yeah, I agree. It's their control freaks. I think that's huge.
But we can't pass federal law.
Yeah, I completely agree. I did some research on paid family leave a while back. And the business case is a big part of that conversation. You know what, though? We showed that businesses benefited from the first paid family leave policy in the United States, which was in California. They don't care. I mean, it's just they can't help it. It's like you propose any you trying to pass a law that says employees have the right to breathe in the workplace, and the Chamber of Commerce will not be against it. Yeah, I mean, just, we're up against, and so I don't know how you change that. You need more than simple, yes.
Yeah.
I think you might be the last person to break it
Can I
up here. Oh, okay, one more after you.
Thank you, exactly, what we're saying here. I think, it's hard for me to accept that, like, decision about the business case, like, if a corporation faced with losing market share, that they would make a decision that would lead them to lose market share. It could be that we're not, thinking about all of the externalities that they're thinking about as well. Because even, for example, here at Wayne's discussion, like, hey, come back and work. Like, hey, well, I teach at home, no big deal. Why do I just come in? Other parking, we want to pay for parking. But we have vendors that are on campus that we need people to support.
I want people to learn something in the classroom. There's that little detail, but anyway.
Yeah, they never heard that.
At home, but yeah, you're gonna lose the revenue generated parking, or the dorms. Why should students, come to Wayne and live in the dorm? They don't have to. Or all the vendors we have in the student center building. So we just think, like, so there could be other variables that we're not taking into account. I'm sure. But anyways, yeah. I'm going hard in sociology department. My question is linked to, when does the power of hourly workers matter?
The power, what?
When does the power of hourly workers matter when it comes to employment concessions? So like, I'm thinking that the workers have the option to go to another job for the same amount of money. Okay, then that would matter.
That's the so-called marketplace bargaining
Okay,
power. Yeah.
If that's at play. The companies don't have a great brand loyalty, or they're losing market share. Or if there's serious competition from another corporation that's very similar. I'll say that, yes, the workers' power would matter. So in those conditions, what power matters? The social, associational, the social, what aspect of worker power matters when conditions are right for them to win concession?
Well, I think, it can be a combination of all of the above,
Okay.
but what I'm just trying to say is they're not all the same.
Okay.
So, I think the labor shortage, which, may be disappearing shortly, right? But has been huge. So the so-called Great Resignation, it turned out, was people moving to better jobs.
All right.
And if you, like those examples I gave of like John Deere, if you can't replace workers, even if they aren't highly skilled, then that gives them power. Like all those things are in the mix, right? And you're right about like the externalities too. I mean, I agree with all that. I just think, for unions to win,
Yeah.
you kind of have to do everything right. Like, right? Like, no, really, because it's not a level playing field. We know that for all the reasons you said. It's very unfair. And so the only way to win is to really check all the boxes. And even then you might lose.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I'm not really answering your question.
No, you did.
But I don't there's a sort of predetermined formula here. It's like, and I think part is the labor leadership to, these are people who dedicate their lives to this stuff, but they're so demoralized and so kind of trapped in a kind of siege mentality that it's really hard for them to see this opportunity that's right in front of them. I think that's why they haven't stepped up very often to help these young folks who are trying to do this stuff. And if they did it, those resources matter and the expertise they have matters, but we see this over and over again. That kind of so sad. I don't know how to fix that.
Yeah.
But that's another factor. Okay, you get the last word. That's
I'm Layla Sachi. I'm a philosopher and historian of Middle East history, and I teach in the Honors College. So what immediately came to my mind when you were wondering about why it is that mostly African-American women who are queer are the leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement, like you were saying specifically. Yeah. My mind immediately goes to epistemology. So like, how do we build knowledge? We build knowledge through experience. What are our experiences? Our experiences being ostracized and being in some cases exploited as like a lone person in a classroom and, you know, the sort of underlying principle in all of this is equity and social justice. And if you've, you know, experienced the negative side of that, then, you know, you have the requisite experience and knowledge to lead and consciousness to lead. So to my mind,
It's not mysterious at all.
it's largely,
Yeah.
it's largely epistemic. And of course, I mean, that of course intersects with psychology, right? And then that intersects with sociology.
It's all related.
So, yeah, right. But
No,
yeah, it's
that-
largely epistemic
I like
and
that.
and condition.
This is similar to what David was saying, but with a
Yeah.
more,
Yeah,
with a root in a more theoretical
right, right.
tradition.
maybe.
Yeah, interesting.
And the other thing that I was thinking about was this worry about this generation. I think that maybe why things are a little bit lackluster in your last graph there is
You're
that
supposed to, like,
might have something to do with internationalism. And it might have something to do with a more broad focus. Because of course, like in the 30s and 40s, what mattered? Nothing except for the United States and what was within our borders.
there was this war against fascism, remember, but
But that was local, right? So it was
a world war.
no, I mean, 30s, 40s, sorry, 50s, 60s. So I think the graph that you showed, correct me if I'm wrong, it was there was a peak right around the 60s, 70s.
In union density, that's right.
yeah.
55 is the peak in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's post World War II.
Mhm.
I misspoke. So the focus is really on development of unions and economy. I mean, there's that old saying, right, that foreign policy is domestic policy, right? But I think that there's, as you said, this larger consciousness about how the work that we do here is affected by what is happening internationally, and that those who have the means and who have the power and who are college educated and so on, you know, that privilege comes at a cost, internationally speaking.
Sure.
And so I think there is an increasing lack of tolerance and lack of acceptance. And the privilege that we talk about as white privilege, I think can be expanded to say, what, Western privilege, American
Northern,
privilege
whatever.
on an international stage, right? And that if we don't recognize the privilege with which we exist in the world, then we are culpable. And when it comes to the election and the uncommitted movement, I think you're right. There are a lot of people who would just say it really fundamentally doesn't make a difference.
Yeah. Well, I think that's short-sighted, but I certainly understand where they're
I
coming
think
from.
it's long-sighted.
Okay.
I think it's long-sighted. It's short-sighted to say that we should vote for Kamala.
Uh-huh.
I think that it's long-sighted to say, you know what? As of now, we shouldn't, because if we want change in the long run, then we need to take a stand
Yeah.
and be.
No, I sympathize with that. I don't agree,
And-
but I
And
understand where you're coming from.
I say
Yeah.
that as a Canadian
Mhm.
doesn't have voting authority here in the
Anyway,
United
yeah.
States. And so
I mean, the other side is just that who is in
I don't-
power in the United States matters for the whole world too. And so in that sense, the lesser evil kind of politics that some of us feel like we have to hold our noses and vote you know, that's where that comes from.
Yeah, and
Right.
there's
So
an
there-
ethical problem there,
Yeah, there is. I
Yeah.
mean, but we don't have a good menu to choose from is the real problem, right?
which is why it's an ethical problem. As I was saying to my colleague, if the election is a public good, then we're really undermining that public good. And the uncommitted movement is a check on that.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm there, but I understand where you're coming from. No, and it's, you know, that's the reality we're.
That's the reality we're
Yeah,
in.
yeah,
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for
Yeah.
all those
Of course.
thoughts.
Thank you
Yeah.
for your talk. I have many notes. It was awesome.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Bob.